Tonight, we gather on ancestral unceded lands belonging to the Methow and Silk people, who are constituents of the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. The traditional territory of these tribes includes all lands within what we now call the Methow and Okanagan Valleys, where tribal citizens and governments continue their long-standing stewardship of cultural and natural resources. We are proud to work alongside them, sharing many common goals. Thank you to the organizations that helped make tonight's event possible. Methow Rising is a local chapter of Indivisible, whose mission is to resist authoritarianism through strategic non-cooperation, community organizing, and effective issue-focused campaigns. Third Act Washington is an organization of Washingtonians over 60 who are determined to make what John Lewis called good trouble in defense of our planet and our democracy. And Resilient Methow, the climate program of Methow Valley Citizens Council. The Citizens Council is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And thanks also to Bridger Layton and the Methow Conservancy for helping out with the logistics of the night. And a final thanks to Old Schoolhouse Brewery for the drinks, and Trails End Bookstore, who is selling Bill McKibben's books. Please visit them after the talk for a book signing with Bill. They're located right over here. And then one last little announcement. There is a donation jar up front just to cover the costs of the barn tonight, if you want to add anything to that. Okay, I think those are all our thank yous. Thank you for being here tonight. Here in the Methow, in a low snow winter, fall atmospheric river, or hot smoky summer, it's hard not to notice the climate impacts in this place that we love so much. 5 years ago, our community came together to create a local climate action plan. The plan was grounded in science from the UW Climate Impacts Group and identified what we can do to reduce our emissions, switch off fossil fuels, and prepare for the impacts and emergencies we do face. Since then, our community has made progress with lots more work to do. This is by no means a complete list, but a few highlights. There's been building retrofits at the Twisp Grange and Methow Valley Community Center that reduce emissions and create clean air and heat refuges. Electric vehicle charging stations and expanded service from Tringo. Solar and battery storage projects at the Okanagan County Electric Co-op, the Methodist Church, and Twisp Civic Center. A new community wildfire protection plan facilitated and written by the Okanagan Conservation District. And last year, Okanagan County rejected Initiative 2117, which would have repealed our landmark climate legislation, the Climate Commitment Act. It's our challenge to continue our progress here at home and also figure out how we connect to the bigger climate movement. Recently, I've had the pleasure of meeting with a group of Liberty Bell students during their lunch breaks for Climate Club. Next week, we'll be heading to Olympia with 5 of these students to meet with our District 7 legislators and share their perspectives and experiences. The students are focusing on preventing the governor's budget from taking Climate Commitment Act funds for other purposes, restoring funding for forest health and wildfire response, and putting some limits and protections on rapidly expanding data centers. At the end of one of our lunchtime meetings a few weeks ago, one of them came up to me at the end and said, "Dana, I've been feeling so upset about the state of the world." Raise your hand if you can relate. I've been feeling so upset about the state of the world, and it feels so good to have something to do. I think that hunger for agency, for purpose, for something to do is why we're all here tonight. Bill McKibben has spent decades helping people move from awareness to action and reminding us that change doesn't come from waiting for someone else to fix things. Thank you, Bill, for making the journey out to the Metau and for bringing the sun with you. Next up, we'll hear from Lisa Verhoevic from Third Act Washington, an organization Bill started. Rather than sitting back and applauding how inspiring young people are, Third Act asks folks on the gray hair end of the spectrum to step up, to use their time, resources, and voices in service of the future young people demand and deserve. Because if we're going to meet this moment, we're going to need all of us, young and old, here in the Metau and far beyond, to show up, stand together, and do something. With that, please join me in welcoming Lisa from Third Act Washington.
My other third actors, which I'll introduce you to later. I know that you all appreciate how beautiful and special this place is, and it is just a remarkable feeling to get this sense of community that you have created here. It is really golden. So I know you are all here to hear Bill McKibben, but please just indulge me for a few minutes to tell you a little bit about Third Act and about Third Act Washington. Third Act was launched by Bill and a small kind of scruffy group of us in 2022 to harness the passion, the skills, resources, and connections of people over 60 around climate and democracy issues. Today, into our fourth year, Third Act has 37 working groups, of which Third Act Washington is one. And these slides that you were seeing on the screen were all scenes from different Third Act working groups all across the country doing actions. We have over 120,000 people who have signed up for our movement. Together, we organize campaigns to accelerate the clean energy transition. We work to cut off the money pipeline to the fossil fuel industry and protect our beloved democracy. Here in Washington State, we have nearly 1,200 Third Act members, and we engage in these campaigns that are developed by Third Act National, but we also focus on local issues. So groups of Third Actors in Spokane, in Olympia, in Bellingham get together and work on national campaigns, but also focus on things that they care about in their own community. We are currently, the projects we're really currently focused on are bringing more public input to the Utilities and Transportation Commission, a very powerful commission that makes decisions that impact all of us with very little public input. We're making our voices heard around data centers and Make Polluters Pay campaign. We brought together a strong coalition of people and developed and found a sponsor for what is called the Coal Act, which will get a hearing in the Senate Ways and Means Committee next week, and Bill has agreed to testify for us. This bill will require that the Washington State Investment Board divest Washington State employee pension funds from supporting coal projects here in Washington. Really excited about that. It'll be a long journey, but we're going to stick with that. And of course, we're working to make solar more accessible and affordable across our state. Right now, it costs 3 times as much to put solar on your roof here in Washington State as it does in Texas, and we want to change that. And really, so importantly, we are working to help people come together, to feel less alone right now, to learn together, and to share ways that, they're ways they're finding to take actions and ways they're finding to just get a good night of sleep. Everything we do in partnership with aligned organizations in Washington State, and we can't and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. So we'd love to find a way to be a presence here in the Metau Valley. Maybe that's forming some kind of a third act hub. Maybe that's gathering third actors to support the work that an existing organization is doing. But we're really excited to explore this further with you. After the program, I encourage you to go over to our third act table and talk with Jock McKinley, Polly Zellweger, and John Kidd. They're members of our core committee for Third Act Washington, and they have come here tonight for this event. Would love to talk to you and give you more information. Okay, now Bill. On to Bill. I am so honored to introduce one of my very best friends, Bill McKibben. Bill and I met in 1985 when he was still early in his journalism career, and he actually had a little bit more hair back then too. He and my husband Sam, who's here tonight, were dashing around New York City as young reporters, finding stories in every corner of the city and having a blast doing it. I could never have imagined, Bill, then that I would be here tonight introducing you as one of our nation's and our world's most effective climate journalists and nonstop rabble-rouser. Bill is the founder of Third Act. He is a contributing writer to The New Yorker and the author of the Substack, The Crucial Years, which if you don't subscribe to, I highly recommend you do. He co-founded the first global grassroots climate campaign, 350.org, and he currently serves as a Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. He was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize in 2014, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel in the Swedish Parliament, and he also won the Gandhi Peace Prize and has honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. I was chatting with someone tonight about what brought them here, and she said she read his book, and I said, which one? And she told me the most recent one, and I said, well, what about the 18 others? And she said, what are you, a Bill McKibben groupie? I guess, because she said, how many have you read? And I've said, all 19. And I said, I kind of am a Bill McKibben groupie. But he has written over a dozen books about the environment, including his very first in 1989, The End of Nature, and I recommend you go back and read it. And his latest book, Here Comes the Sun, A Last Chance for the Climate and a Fresh Chance for Civilization, a book that is filled with hope and inspiration, lots of ideas and lots of data. He is an indefatigable writer. Sometimes I just think he writes while he's sleeping. I don't know how he does it. So please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben.
Working? Yes. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for that overkind introduction, and Dana for getting all this arranged, and all of you for being here. This is an extraordinary treat for me, and not only because of how rare it is that I get to speak someplace where they're selling beer. I wrote, when I was very young, back in the 1980s in New York, I wrote the very first article in a national magazine about what we were calling microbreweries back then. And I'm afraid it's a hobby I've stayed with my whole life. And this old schoolhouse stuff is very, very good. So many, many thanks. So much fun for me to be here. I've heard about this place and its skiing culture my whole life because cross-country skiing is my particular vice. And so, I watched on the TV as Sadie Bjornson and Eric Bjornson skied, and they'd always talk about them coming from the Methow Valley, and now your remarkable Novi McCabe headed off to Cortina, and on and on. And then my cousin Craig McKibben would talk to me about it, and KC and Golden and Christy would tell me, gotta come out, and I'd never quite managed to make it, and now I'm here and it's far better even than in my imagination. We skied yesterday up to Rendezvous Pass, and then today out this magnificent Jack's Trail to the end of the valley, and it just, to see people, so many people out enjoying, and also to have the understanding that these places where I've been, that they could have been something altogether different. That the place where I was out today could have been a golf course, and that the hills that I was looking up at could have been a big commercial ski resort, and instead they're this combination of well-loved, beautiful, and very intact place because of the work that y'all have done over the decades to make that happen. And that makes the place all the more special, that it doesn't have to be here in this way, and it might well not have been were it not for extraordinary devotion and work. So it just could not be more fun for me, which makes me feel particularly guilty for having to spend at least a few minutes with on the trouble that we're in right now. As beautiful as this day was, in our country and in our world, it was one of the darkest days in a very long time. There are two huge, and I think interlinked, very bad things happening on planet Earth right now. One of them is the rise of authoritarianism in place after place, but most painfully right now in our own country. And today is one of those days that will be remembered, I think, the way that we remember Kent State. We watched a remarkable human being, by all accounts, gunned down by a crew of masked federal agents in the street for no reason, as part of this ongoing horror that we're seeing around the country. It's very, very hard to even begin to figure out how to think about that and react to it, because we've spent so many decades thinking that we lived in a very different kind of country, and we're not attuned yet for quite how to deal with it. But the people of Minneapolis are doing an astonishing job. They're writing a new chapter. They're writing a new chapter in the history of nonviolent resistance that in its way is as powerful as the bus boycott in Montgomery 70 years ago this year, or the Salt March in India 95 years ago this year. It's remarkable to watch. Someone just sent me a clip from a pretty big protest in Boston tonight, where the storm is descending and it's bitter cold, but there are a lot of people out there, and what they were chanting was, "We're not cold, we're not afraid, Minnesota taught us to be brave." And I think we're going to have to remember this day and that idea. And of course, the other terrible thing that's happening in this world, the most important thing that humans have ever done, the biggest thing that humans have ever done, is this steady rise in the temperature of the planet. And now, I wrote the first book about this back when we were calling it the greenhouse effect in the 1980s, a book with the cheerful title, The End of Nature. And the stuff that we were writing about then is now come true. It's what we all live with day after day and year after year. And you all live with it, obviously, in enormous close proximity. That summer is now a time when you're smelling smoke more days than not. That winter brings not necessarily snow now, but rain, and in such quantities that it washes away bridges and takes out roads and culverts. That's terrible. I have extraordinary sympathy for you. In Vermont, where I live, we've had the 2 worst floods in our history in the last 4 years. Our town was cut off from the world for weeks because the highway west and east of town was breached by the river. This is happening all over, but of course it's happening worst in the places where we have the fewest cameras and where people have done the least to cause the problem. I think often of the fact that the week after the worst flooding in Vermont 2 years ago, the great rains moved to North Africa. In Libya, they had a rainfall so intense that the flood washed out 2 dams, and then it swept into a coastal city where it pushed 10,000 people out to sea, where they drowned in the course of an hour. That kind of thing happens now with some regularity across the vulnerable developing world. And it's worth remembering that forget Libya, the entire continent of Africa has put 3% of all the carbon dioxide that's in the air, compared with our country, which is responsible for about 1/4 of it, even though we represent only 4% of the people on this planet. It's extraordinarily difficult sometimes to comprehend the scale of that as well, and to come to terms with how to deal with it, because as with that kind of surge of state violence in this country, we're not exactly prepared for it. Our sense of how the world works is still measured in some older way where we expect winter to be winter. And we can't help that. It's just sort of part of who we are, but it makes it difficult. So, the worst is over. What I really want to talk about today is the one big good thing that's happening on this planet. And it's big enough and good enough that it stands some chance of helping us deal with those 2 crises. And it is the sudden, remarkable rise of clean energy around the planet. This stuff that we've been calling our whole lives alternative energy, but all of a sudden is not. All of a sudden is the obvious, straightforward, common sense way to power the planet. 95% of new electric generation last year around this world came from the sun and the wind. That's brand new. I'll tell the story in just the most outline form. You know, we invented the first industrial wind turbine was in my state, Vermont, in 1943. And in 1954, the first solar cell was invented at Bell Labs in Edison, New Jersey. And when it was invented, it was the most expensive power on Earth. The only thing you could put it in was satellites, because there was no other way to power them, so it didn't matter how much it cost. But over the intervening 70 years, some combination of activism and engineering has steadily brought that price down. It began in the US in the 1970s in response to the oil crises, when Jimmy Carter, a prescient and prophetic man in many ways, understood that this might be our ticket out, and he began not only to put solar panels on the roof of the White House, but to put in the federal budget large amounts of money to research and develop this technology. His last budget that would have been adopted had he been elected again in 1980 the intent was to provide enough research money that America would be getting 20% of its power from the sun by the year 2000. Had we done that, we would live on a different planet today, a much cooler one. We didn't. We elected Ronald Reagan. He took the solar panels off the roof and the White House, and he took all that money out of the budget, and he put us squarely on our baby drill course, where we've spent all the years that followed. Happily, at the turn of the century, activists in Germany, the Green Party, which held the balance of power in their parliamentary system used their leverage to enact this series of subsidies. They called it the Energiewende, a feed-in tariff for people who put power on the solar panels on their roof would get a good price, a subsidy from the government for that power that they supplied to the grid. They paid a lot of money, the government, for it, and that money, most of it, flowed to China, where people began the process of figuring out, with that demand, how to build these panels cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and wind turbines as well. About 4 years ago, we crossed some invisible line where it became cheaper to produce power from the sun and the wind than from setting things on fire. And that's a completely epochal moment for human civilization. The archaeologists tell us we've been burning things for the last 700,000 years. And it's mostly been good, you know. We learned to cook food, that gave us the big brain. We were able to move north and south from the equator. Nobody was living in Winthrop prior to fire. The anthropologists say that standing around the campfire for millennia, eon upon eon, helps account for some of the social bonds that sort of a proto-Zoom, you know. And then when we learned to control the combustion of coal and oil and gas, that was the Industrial Revolution, and it gave us modernity, everything around us. But the price of it has gotten much too high now. And so it's very good news that at this exact moment is coming online this possibility of change, that we live in a world where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. And that has, in those last 4 years, sparked extraordinary change in many places. Most of all in China, where they've accomplished feats of engineering that are almost impossible to comprehend. In May of last year, the Chinese were putting up 3 gigawatts of solar power a day. A gigawatt's the rough equivalent of a big coal-fired power plant. So they were building one of those out of solar panels every 8 hours. Okay? China's now peaked its carbon emissions into the atmosphere, and they've started to fall. They went down last year, while America's went up 2.5%. Its coal use has peaked, while America's is now on the rise again. But it's not just China. There's lots of other places where we can start to see what this looks like as it's built out. California took this very seriously for its own reasons, having a lot to do with air quality. They put up a lot of solar panels, so many that in California now, most days, more than 100% of electricity comes from renewable sources for long periods of the day. At night, when the sun goes down, the biggest source of supply to the grid is usually batteries that have been soaking up excess sunshine all afternoon. Batteries that didn't exist 3 years ago. In one of the great ironic notes of this whole story, the place that's now passed California for installing clean energy in America is the state of Texas, which is also the world headquarters of the hydrocarbon industry, but the economics are so overwhelming that they really can't be denied. Last year, the fossil fuel industry tried to use its power in Austin to shut down a lot of this renewable build-out. They thought they were going to pass a series of bills that would have, for instance, well, the most prominent was one that they were calling DEI for natural gas. It would have required that if you put up 5 megawatts worth of solar power, you had to build 5 megawatts worth of gas turbine. They thought this was going to pass, but people appeared mostly from the rural hinterlands across Texas to say, don't do this. We pay for our school system with solar power now. This is how we keep the old folks' home alive in our place, and don't do it. And the state legislature backed away. They returned to the more pressing business of redistricting Texas to provide extra seats for Donald Trump. But it's incredibly beautiful to watch this happen, especially in the poorest parts of the world. Pakistan has been hit harder by climate change than any country on earth. The temperature now in its urban areas routinely reaches well into the 120s during the summer. And they've had the two biggest floods since Noah on this planet in 2010 and 2023. The last one covered a third of the country. So it's beautiful to be able to say that Pakistan's probably grown solar power faster than any nation on earth over the last 2 years. Not because of any government program, but because Pakistanis, tired of expensive and unreliable electricity, started importing vast quantities of cheap solar panels from their neighbor, China, and people went on YouTube and TikTok to see how to put them together. They've built 17 gigawatts in the last year, of solar power, one rooftop at a time across Pakistan. That's the equivalent of half their existing national electric grid. So the farmers were early adopters. Those of you who've spent time in rural Asia know that the soundtrack of much of that part of the world is the hum of cough of diesel pumps that are bringing up irrigation water from the deep tube wells that are the legacy of the green revolution of the 60s. That diesel's often the biggest single budget item for your peasant farmer. So they were quick early adopters of this new technology. They usually lack the money to build the kind of metal structures that we're used to seeing to hold solar panels in place. They've just been laying them on the ground and pointing them at the sun. Pakistani farmers used 35% less diesel last year than they had the year before, which is a huge savings for them and a huge savings for the planet. California used 40% less natural gas to produce electricity last year than they did 2 years before. 40% fall in the use of natural gas in the fourth largest economy in the world. That's the kind of number that begins to change how hot the world gets if we're able to spread it and spread it very fast. Right now, the most beautiful part of this story is happening very quickly in Africa, where along Chinese trade routes, solar panels are going up with extraordinary speed. There are 600 or 700 million people in sub-Saharan Africa who don't have access to electricity. 250 years of coal has done absolutely nothing for them. Gas, oil, the same thing, never reached there. But all of a sudden, they're able to get cheap solar panels, and they are going up with extraordinary speed. And when you get to go to those places, and I've watched it in Ivory Coast and Ghana and Tanzania and things, it's unbelievably moving to see people who've never had power suddenly overnight have it. I was sitting in Ghana in a remote village, and it was near the equator, so it was very hot, and I'm a Vermonter, so I don't deal well with heat, and the nice village elders kept handing me cold bottles of water to drink, and it took me in my clueless Western way a good 15 or 20 minutes to figure out why they were so proud to be doing that, until the day before, when their solar system had gone online. That village had never had anything cold. This was new, and that was powerful to see, and it's happening now every day someplace. This is beautiful news for everybody on Earth, except if you own an oil well or a coal mine. And then it is the worst possible news. They have decided to game our political system just as hard as they can to allow their business model to last a while longer. You'll recall that candidate Trump told big oil executives that if they donated $1 billion to his campaign, he would give them anything that they wanted. They coughed up about $500 million in ads, in donations, in lobbying and things, and that was plenty because the administration has done, as you know, absolutely everything they can to derail this transition in this country. They've shut down wind farms that are 90% complete off the Atlantic seaboard. They've put federal lands off limits to solar development, even as they've opened them up for new coal mining. On and on and on and on. It's absurd. Our president in Davos last week, among all the other absurd things that he was saying, gave a long soliloquy about how the Chinese were not using wind. They were selling wind power to everybody, but they wouldn't use it themselves. And there's no wind farms in China. Every world leader sitting in that room listening to him knew that he was lying, because China, in fact, is producing 40% of the wind power on Earth. If you look at a map, the entire coast of China is dotted with wind turbines. They're every year produce larger and larger ones. This year they've produced easily recyclable 300-foot turbine blades for the biggest of their windmills. What the administration has done in the course of a year is national self-sabotage on a scale that we've never seen before. They've ceded the technological and with it economic future to what is theoretically our chief adversary in the world. This stuff was invented in the United States, and now we're doing everything we can to quash it. It won't work. The rest of the world will continue to do this, but it will slow it down. And slowing it down is the thing that we cannot have happen, because the climate crisis is on a very short timetable. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us a couple of years ago that if we wanted to have any hope of keeping anywhere near the targets we set in Paris, that we needed to cut emissions in half by 2030, which is now 3 years and 11 months away. Okay? So we've got extraordinary work to do. We have the tools to do it with, and they work economically. Our job, therefore, is to make them work politically, to provide the push in this country that allows us to be a full part of this transition and to make it happen. So I'm going to talk for just a minute about how we respond. And I'm going to begin by talking about who we is. I'm looking at the demographics of this room with great pleasure, because as Lisa said, I think that people of a certain age are absolutely critical to how this plays out. There are 70 million Americans over the age of 60. We have lots of skills built up over a lifetime, lots of connections, lots of time. We punch above our weight politically because everybody in this room voted in the last election. There is no known way to stop old people from voting. Which is why 1,200 people in Third Act Washington at the State House make a huge difference, because every legislator there knows that they represent people who are going to be voting, and it is a power. We've seen it now in place after place around the country, the power that that can have. So, a lot of tasks that we need. One of them, of course, in defense of our democracy, which is, among other things, necessary if we're going to make progress on climate and energy, but is necessary just for its own thing. We need to be out in the streets protesting, and we will. If you've been to the No King's Day things and to the things that have been happening in TWISP every Saturday and things, and I'm sure that many of you have, and thank you for it, then you know that people with hairlines like mine are overrepresented, which is good. We've been working hand in glove with the people at Indivisible and 5051 and things to turn people out for these big protests, and those are very important. They've helped with the basic task of making this administration unpopular. Now we need to turn that unpopularity into votes at the next election. this midterm election is going to be, well, it's going to be a fight to make sure that it happens. The Attorney General of the United States today put out a statement saying that they would call off ICE in Minnesota if the state of Minnesota would turn over its voter rolls to the federal government. It sort of gives away the game about what's happening, you know. Fight to make sure they happen, and then fight to make sure that we show up and win and begin to put some dent into the authoritarian cult that is at the moment controlling our country. But there's also, simultaneously, lots of important work to be done at the state and local level around this absolutely crucial energy transition. We've got this big campaign going at Third Act that we call Simplify Solar. And it's because, as Lisa pointed out, it costs 3 times as much to put solar on your roof in most of this country as it does in Australia or the EU or anyplace else. And it's not because of the price of panels. Tariffs have driven them up a little bit, but not much. It's basically because we just treat this stuff differently than every other country on Earth. Every place else on this planet, putting up a solar system is pretty much like getting a new refrigerator. You call somebody on Monday morning, by Friday they've been up on the roof, connected the things up, you're on the grid, ready to go. Here, it takes months, and we have 15,000 jurisdictions in this country. Every one of them has their own set of rules and teams of inspectors and on and on and on, and it just drags on forever, and the price goes up and up. What's the result of that? Well, Australia, where, as I say, it's a third the price that it is here, 40% of homes have solar panels on the roof. They've got so much solar power in Australia that later this year, beginning June 1st, everybody in Australia is going to get 3 free hours of electricity every afternoon forever. Everybody in Australia will quickly be timing their dishwasher and their washing machine to run in the afternoon. They'll be charging their EV. They'll be filling their storage battery, which are now quite cheap, with power during the afternoon and running their home all night. The human labor to produce energy, the hundreds of thousands of years of gathering firewood or the centuries of raising the money to pay your power bill, sort of vanishing finally in a truly, I mean, if you're thinking about affordability, this is the single biggest thing that could possibly happen. And it could happen here as easily as in Australia or any place else. That's why we're working hard on these campaigns to make it much easier to put this stuff up, not just for people with roofs, but also for apartment dwellers. 3 or 4 million Europeans have put up what they call balcony solar in the last 3 years. These are extraordinarily simple solar rigs. They're just a panel designed to hang over the railing of a balcony or be propped up on a patio or something like that. And you just plug them into the wall. No electrician needed, okay? And they often produce 20 or 25% of the power that an apartment uses, and they're illegal everywhere in this country, except the state of Utah, which in March, unanimously in both houses of the legislature, passed a bill enabling people to, on the logic that, as the libertarian Republican who introduced the bill said, if this is good enough for the people of Stuttgart, it's good enough for the people of Salt Lake City. And now you can go on YouTube and see lots of pictures of videos of earnest, happy Utahns plugging in their solar systems. I plugged in one of these in our house in Vermont a couple of weeks ago. Technically, it's illegal. I don't think they're going to come arrest me, but if they do, that'll be okay, you know? We can make this happen everywhere. There's a bill in the state of Washington that may not even make it through for consideration this year, but it'd be worth calling your legislature to say, there's no reason not to do this. It costs nothing. Let me just end here, because I've rattled on for a while, by saying a couple of other things about the possibility of the moment. And I say them because this is such a sad and hard day. And if I sound, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm not as fluent as I usually am tonight, and it's just because I just, at some level, feel so soul sick by what happened today. This man that was killed today was a very, very good man. He was a nurse in the ICU of the Veterans Administration, and they were showing a video tonight of him. A veteran had died in their emergency room, and he was reading out a sort of little proclamation talking about the man's life and the service he'd rendered and what it meant. It was like a scene from The Pit, but it was completely real, and now he's dead. And it kills me. So let's talk for a minute about the beauty that's possible here. Yes, we need to put up a lot of solar energy for climate reasons, and we should do it because it's economically sensible and all of that. But you know, there's also something else. As long as we depend on fossil fuel, then we depend on a few scattered deposits around the world, the owners of which are always going to have too much power and too much money. That's Vladimir Putin fighting, using his winnings to fight the war in Ukraine. That's the Koch brothers, our biggest oil and gas barons, more refining and pipeline capacity than anyone in America, using their winnings to degrade our democracy, to rot it out so it was easy for Trump to push it over. That's the king of Saudi Arabia. Imagine what the last 100 years would have been like, what the sort of geopolitics of the world would have been like if oil had been of trivial value during that period. How many wars and coups and assassination attempts and things we would have avoided. You don't have to actually think very hard, because we have the very recent example of our attack on Venezuela. And to his credit, Donald Trump made no effort to explain that it had anything to do with democracy or human rights or anything else. He just said, you have oil, we want the oil, we're coming to get it. That's the world that we don't need to live in if we run it on sun and wind, because there's some of that everywhere on this planet. And belligerent as humans are, it will be difficult for us to figure out how to fight a war over sunshine. So, as a step to take down some of the authoritarians on this planet, this seems to me one of the most obvious, practical, and straightforward things that we can do. And we get to do it in service of, in service of something that's, or in connection with something as beautiful as the sun. Now, I've been hearing from, humans have a very, very deep connection with our local star. I've been hearing that it's been foggy and cloudy for weeks here in the Methow Valley. I don't believe a word of it, because it's been sunny the whole time I've been here, and I assume you're just saying this to keep people from coming. But it is a good reminder of there's not a human being in the world who doesn't break out into a grin when the sun comes out from behind a cloud and hits them on the shoulder blades. We don't know how prehistoric people thought about things, because being prehistoric, they failed to write them down. But we do know that all the piles of rock they left behind, all the thousands of versions of Stonehenge around the world, all point to the solstice or the equinox. The minute that humans started inventing mythologies, the very first job was to explain how this thing rose over here and set over here and then got back over here in the morning to rise again. And so their world is replete with fantastic stories about giant emus who swallow the sun and then vomit it up each morning, and on and on and on. I got to go to Rome in September. The new Pope had called people over for a conference at the 10th anniversary of Francis's remarkable encyclical Laudato Si on global warming. And I was very curious to go, because I wanted to see up close the new Pope, and he is a weirdly normal Midwestern American, if he came over to your house for Thanksgiving dinner, you'd just think your bachelor uncle had appeared, you know. I liked him enormously, and he said, we're sticking exactly with the Francis program on all of this. Indeed, in a couple of months, they're going to flip a switch on a solar farm that they've built on the outskirts of Rome, and Vatican City will become the first fully solar-powered nation on the planet. If you had told me, by the way, 20 years ago, that one of the leading progressive institutions on the planet was going to be the Roman Catholic Church, I might not have fully believed you, but there we are. Things can change for the good, not just for the bad, you know. So when I got up to speak at this conference, I said, I think this is the best news ever, and I think it provides us with our mantra going forward. Energy from heaven, not from hell. And I think it's entirely possible for you guys to play a huge role in that. Okay? And you're already doing some of it with the work that you're doing locally here with the Climate Action Plan and all the stuff that's going on. And it's beautiful to see. And place after place. And I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher, so I was very happy to hear that the Methodist Church here is now powering itself from the sun. On and on. But you also have to figure out how to take the extraordinary energy, political energy that has preserved this enchanted place and put it to work also in the larger world. Because as wonderful as the Methow Valley is, it cannot protect its own future within its own boundaries. Can't protect it from the forces of politics in the world. Nobody in Minneapolis thought a year ago that they were going to be mourning the dead and having to organize themselves every day to follow government agents around. And you can't protect yourselves from the climate. That atmospheric river that dumped all that water on you, that's because the ocean is so warm now. The warmer air can hold far more water vapor than cold, and that's what's going to keep happening until we figure out how to start turning the temperature down. So, on a terrible, terrible, dark day, there are rays of light, literal light, and it comes from the sun, and you will figure out how to play the part that you can in letting them illuminate and bless this troubled, difficult moment in time. Thank you all very much. I got a mic.
Working? There we go. Yay. Well, friends, we're going to have a little chat. I am KC Golden, and the only thing I want to say tonight, by way of introduction, is that I'm Dana Golden's dad.
And beyond that, Casey, I've known most of the great climate warriors on this planet. Been friends with many of them from Greta on down, and Casey is among the most effective, the most indefatigable in it for a very long time and doing an extraordinary job. So what a pleasure to
I have been promising Bill some good skiing in the Methow Valley for a very long time now. So I was probably the only person in the valley who every day was celebrating the rise of the ice fog over the last 2 weeks, which preserved enough snow. People thought I was going crazy, but we indeed were able to deliver on some amazing skiing over the last couple of days.
If I can just interrupt to say, whoever it is that grooms this ski trails, I actually literally wrote a book about cross-country skiing. I took 1 year off from failing to save the planet to write a book about my adventures in cross-country skiing. So I've skied pretty much every player on the planet, and this is, it is unbelievable out there. So thank you, whoever it is that's driving the fishing bully.
The next book should be Wizards of the Piston Bullies.
There you go.
I'm going to pose a few questions and ask for a few questions from you all. I want to say I've been working with Bill since, I guess we knew each other earlier, but really since the mid-2000s. And, by that time, the climate fight, in most of the ways you think about it, was not really that mysterious. The science had been in for at least 20 years before that. That wasn't a mystery. The technology, the solar wasn't so cheap, but it was pretty obvious that if we put our minds to it, that's where the energy was going to come from. The sun had been coming up every day for the last 4.5 billion years without a single outage, and delivering as much energy to the Earth as in an hour as humans use in a year. So it was kind of a logical candidate. We had that part figured out. We even had the policy designs and the economics. We really thought we knew how to move forward, and of course we didn't. We were blocked, and it turned out that part of what we lacked was a movement and people power, and part of the reason we lacked it is because we were stuck in the wrong story about climate, a story about our own personal complicity and powerlessness to do much about it, and guilt and inability to affect this and that and the other thing. And that story really wasn't getting us very far. So what we needed was not another engineer, not another climate scientist, not another political theorist, but a really good writer to get us a different story. And it turns out that one was already on hand. He had already been working on climate for a long time. But he really started to emerge as the country's preeminent climate leader around the mid-2000s, and crucially build a movement in large part by changing the story and offering us a new narrative. And it was such a delight. You have all now been exposed to a story about climate I bet you haven't heard before, and one that I hope will bring as much kind of energy and passion and hope to you as it has to the climate movement. It really lifted up the climate movement in a way that we just desperately needed, and helped us really find our groove in the mid-2000s. And I won't, describe that whole narrative here, but the two things I want to say about it is, Bill was not the first person to discover the importance of narrative work in building political power and building movements. But a distinguishing feature of Bill's narrative, especially now in this day and age, is it is absolutely true. A lot of people in politics have figured out that narrative is really important, and seem to think that that's sort of a license to say whatever the hell they want, regardless of how much it corresponds to the reality of the situation. And I think, it's such a rare and important thing, especially now when we're all, kind of grasping and trying to figure out how to hold on to the preeminence of just the objective reality of our circumstances on the planet as kind of the first piece of information for figuring out what we're going to do, that we have a narrative that's both powerful and inspiring and true. The second thing about the narrative is it really helped us find our footing and our power at a time when we really lacked it in the climate fight. And I just can't tell you how important and uplifting that has been to the movement. It, for the first time, featured us as protagonists and heroes and agents in the story. And So both in the books themselves and Bill's leadership in the just indefatigability of Bill's organizing, he just absolutely won't take no for an answer. And that example of just determination, I think, has helped us all answer the question that's always on our minds about climate. You know, when Bill said, I could feel the room, when you said, you all could really play an important role, there was kind of like this, everybody was kind of saying, well, really? Can we? And we always have, you know, all these moments come when we wonder, what can we really do about something at this scale? Can I really be effective? Can we really overcome this? And the beauty of Bill's narrative is not that it says, well, yes, of course you can, just get out there and we'll win. Is he's honest about it. He says, we don't know if we'll win. We don't really know in the end how much difference we can make. The one thing we know is we can get out there, roll up our sleeves, get our feet set, and damn well find out how much difference we can make. And that example has powered so much of the climate movement over the last 20 years. So one more time, please give it up with me. So one of the things you said to me about movements and our power, and said to all of us, that really has stuck with me and proved really useful over the years, is we were organizing for the Paris climate talks, and we'd had this just crushing disappointment in Copenhagen a few years before that, and we had a number of setbacks on the way to the climate talks. And Bill said to the assembled organizers there, remember, Paris, he was a little skeptical about how much energy we were putting into it, frankly, because of the kinds of results we had gotten in the past. But he said, Paris and the Conference of the Parties, the Paris Climate Meeting, is the scoreboard, not the game. And I remember that really stuck with me. It's stuck with me in legislative fights, and has served me and a lot of activists really well. Changed how we thought about the results we were looking for and what we really needed to deliver when we showed up. And I wanted to ask you to tell me a little bit more about what you meant when you said that.
Well, I mean, it's extremely apropos given the truly important event tomorrow at the football stadium in Seattle. No, all I meant was people put a lot of faith and worry and intensity and focus on things like these annual climate talks and things. But whether or not, what comes out of them is determined not by what happens at them. There's just a bunch of diplomats sitting around talking. It's determined by how much organizing and work has been done to change the game. So yes, some of you will remember Copenhagen all the way back in 2009, which was a terrible disappointment, and nothing happened. There was no agreement about climate, and it was because, well, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton faced no penalty for coming back with nothing from it. There wasn't a movement that could hold them to account. We spent the next 5 or 6 years building that movement. By the time we got to Paris, we'd had, say, well, 350.org had organized 20,000 demonstrations in every country on earth except North Korea. We'd had 400,000 people in the streets of New York for a big climate march, things like that. There was no way in 2015 that Barack Obama could come back from Paris and say, sorry, nothing happened, forget it. In the same way that, people did tons and tons of great organizing, the Sunrise Movement around the Green New Deal, Bernie, all that work, that meant that Joe Biden had to deliver, and then did with the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's never the inside machinations and things that are important. Those are just reflections of how much political power you've managed to build up. And, right now, frankly, the political power, the right wing managed to build up an immense amount of political power, and that's why they're not winning because they have better arguments about anything or whatever. They're cashing in the political power that they spend a long time building at all kinds of levels, especially the local level on up. And we have to figure out how to match that if we're going to overcome it. I think that we can, because the arguments that we have to make in many ways are much easier than the ones that they have to make. I mean, at this point, you know, if you're talking about, say, energy and climate, the argument you have to make if you're Donald Trump is that we should spend way more money to produce much dirtier power, you know? And so you really have to work hard to make that argument. They've been able to do it so far, but I think we'll be able to, I hope we'll be able to organize to overcome it. I hope that when we get to the midterm elections this time, that the price of electricity is as important as the price of eggs was at the last election. And I think that if it is, we'll be able to argue successfully that it was not a good idea to A, allow every data center that any billionaire ever wanted to build, and B, cut off the supply of cheap energy from the sun and the wind. It's no great mystery that if you increase demand and decrease supply, the price will go way up, as indeed it has. So that's the kind of argument we should be able to break in our favor, but we've got to do the organizing to make it happen.
Bill, you have led young folks in the climate fight. You're leading old folks in the climate fight now. But you've also said some really important things that I think about the connection and the work we do together. I want to take a moment. Dana talked a little bit about a very inspiring climate club at the Liberty Bell High School. And we have at least a couple of them here. Mira and Marie from Liberty Bell Climate Club. And I think they have a question for us. Do they have a mic, Dana? Yay.
Okay, hello, I'm Mart Nelson.
Hi, I'm Mira.
We are both junior board members on the Metro Valley Citizens Council, and we also got the Liberty Bell Climate Club moving again after COVID happened. My question tonight is, what would you see as the role for young people in the climate movement, and how can we best work together with older folks or people in their third act as
Absolutely.
around me?
It's the perfect question, y'all. And thank you for it, and thank you for your good work. So yeah, I've spent much of my life organizing with young people. We started 350.org, which became the first big global climate movement. Myself and 7 undergraduates at Middlebury College, where I do a little work. The most important question you should be asking is, where should I go to college? And the answer is Middlebury, and we'll look forward to you coming to visit us soon. And one of the great things about that organizing that we started there at 350.org was that we had no idea what we were doing. Like none. I'm a writer. You can tell from listening to me, I'm not a great orator and, organizing. I had no idea. But we knew we wanted to try and organize the world around work on climate. So we just set out to do it. There were 7 young people. There are 7 continents. Each one took one. The one that took the Antarctic also had to take the internet. And, 2 years later, we had this first big day of action, and we had 5,100 simultaneous demonstrations in 181 countries. And it was a kind of coming out party for the climate movement, and it was very much that sort of energy of young people all over the place. And that continues. Young people have been at the absolute forefront of this work, as many of you know from watching people like Greta Thunberg, one of the great organizers of all time. Because she was great at, among other things, at telling stories. Her announcement that she wasn't going to go to school anymore because if the leaders of the world couldn't be bothered to produce a world that it would be, that she could grow old in, why should she bother to educate herself for that? It was such a smart way of getting that message across, And soon there were 10 million young people out on strike in September of 2019 before the COVID pandemic. So young people have provided key leadership here and will continue to. And there are good ways for the rest of us to figure out how to back them up. So I'll give you an example. When the very first thing we did at 350, Third Act, before we were even officially quite formed, was that friends of mine in the Fridays for the Future movement, which was the kind of American offshoot of Greta's youth movement, high school kids called me up and said, we want to take on the big banks, Citi, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the 4 biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry on the planet. We want to demonstrate, take them on, but we don't have checking accounts. We don't have credit cards, so they might not listen to us. And can you help? I was like, well, if there's one thing we have, it's credit cards. So yes, we'll help. And the first demonstration that we Third Act ever participated in was in Boston, outside Citibank, and it was organized by young people, and there were hundreds of high school students on hand, because in my experience, high school students understand very well the barrel of the gun down which they are staring, and they have good reason to. They're going to have to spend their whole lives dealing with the world that we're creating. So they were there, and they were somewhat sprier, so they were at the head of the march. But at the back of the march, there was a bunch of us from this nascent Third Act with a big banner that just said, "Fossils against fossil fuels." And it was the right message. Partly all the young people were like, it was partly the right message, because you correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense is that if you're young right now, part of this thing that we're calling climate anxiety has a lot to do with the kind of feeling that you've just been left to deal with this problem yourself, that older people got most of the good stuff in the world, and I've heard way too many people my age say, well, it's up to the next generation to solve this problem, So what we need to be doing is, whenever there are things that you want to do, figure out how to back you up in that work, and then figure out some things to do ourselves. Because we come from different, you have many, many decades ahead of living on this planet, and so you have a very particular and important set of reasons for caring about this. And for those of us who are much closer to the exit than to the entrance, as it were, we have a different set of reasons. And they increasingly have to do with what once seemed a very abstract idea of legacy, but it seems less abstract all the time. Legacy just means the world you leave behind for the people you love the most. And we're on the verge of leaving behind a world that's much worse than the one that we were born into. But we have a particular gift to give as well as older people. And that's the gift of knowing that change is possible. Because if you're in your Third Act now, your First Act came in this moment of extraordinary transformation in the 1960s and 1970s. The moment when we started taking women seriously in public life, the apex of the civil rights movement. The first Earth Day, when 20 million Americans, 10% of the then population, were out in the streets. So as big as No King's Day was, and we organized very hard to make it big, Earth Day in 1970 was 3 times as big, and incredibly effective. Within 18 months, we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the EPA, all the things that the Trump administration is now destroying because they were extraordinarily effective. So that's got to be part of our gift back, and part of our motivation is this sense that big change is possible. So I hope very much that a kind of, along with all the other good work that's going on here in the Valley, that a kind of node that connects up to Third Act gets going here. And if it does, I hope that one of its first projects is to be working hard with your club at the school on things and providing a way for you and people your age to also be having an impact at a national and an international scale. I told that story about the beginning of 350.org just to say young people are entirely capable of making change, not just in their school and not just in their community, but in the larger world too. So think big, is what I would say.
We'll be right there with you. Mira.
Perfect. To follow up Marit's question, kind of more on being a youth in a small community, sometimes local action can feel small in the face of global politics and big polluters. How do you think the role of local climate action within the need for global climate change?
So it's a perfect question, and it's the reason that we've set up, say, Third Act in the way that we have, with local state chapters, local nodes, things, but also connected to a kind of national thing. We need to be doing work close to home, because that's where actual physical change happens. There are, 5,000 furnaces in this valley that need to be turned into heat pumps, and there are 5,000 gas stoves that need to be turned into induction cooktops, and there, on and on. That's where but it's hard to make that change happen just here. You need to be in Olympia and Washington, D.C. too, making the kind of change in policy that makes all of that easier. The perfect example is the work around that everybody did, young people more than anybody else in the Sunrise Movement, to produce what became the Inflation Reduction Act that was going to provide the money that we needed to help make that transition possible. And the oil industry understood that for the threat that it was, and that's why the first act of the new GOP Congress was to pull that money away. So along with doing the work here close to home, you need to be able to start figuring out how to help on a national and state level too. Look, not to put too fine a point on it, there's elections coming up in November. If the Republican Party still controls the Congress after them, then literally nothing will change on any of this. And so that's one of the tasks that we have before us. I wish that there was, I always wish because, well, I wish that purely local action was enough to deal with these things. I wish that because as happy as I am to be here, I really would just like to stay home in Vermont all the time. And just work on, and Vermont's just like the Met, it's exactly the same, cross-country skiing and good beer, and it was basically the same place, just with shorter mountains, But we also need that. So it's very good to have things like Third Act that can do half their work close to home and half tied into this national network that allows us sometimes to come together for big things. A perfect example that we did at Third Act this past year was this thing we called Sunday, that some of you may have helped with in September. It was the first big sort of national celebration of renewable energy in 50 years. And we had 500 events across the country. And one of the results of that national organizing was that now in this legislative session, in about 22 state legislatures, there are these bills to allow this plug-in solar to happen. And I think we'll win in at least a dozen of them. And I think that'll be enough to set a national market for this technology and allow it to spread very rapidly. So there's some mix of the national and the local that's always the key to things.
Are you two going to Olympia next week?
I am. Marit had some other things going on, but yeah. There are 5 kids going, and we have some meetings planned, so it's exciting.
Far out. That's what we need. And you tell the legislators, say, if you don't listen to us, we're going to sick a bunch of old people on you. And that's the last thing you want to deal with, so it's...
Send pictures while you're down there, will ya? Great. Well, gosh, we're running a little low on time.
Yeah, I talked way too long.
No, it's so good, Bill. I wonder, maybe if we can come back a little bit. People have fed me questions, and you've responded to almost all of them. I wonder, I was really pleased that you started where you started today, with the significance of this day, somewhat beyond what we're talking about, but then also made the connections to what we're talking about. And you talked about the connections between climate and authoritarianism and solar energy. But to the extent that ICE is not just about authoritarianism, but it's also about immigration, and to the extent that immigrants play such an important role in this county and in our lives, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more and take us a little beyond the valley about the relationship between climate and immigration.
Well, let's just talk about the whole world. I mean, let's just be very clear. We're not going to stop global warming at this point. It is too late for that, sadly. But we may have, with the technologies that I've been describing, have the ability now, which we didn't have even a few years ago, to realistically start shaving tenths of a degree off how hot the planet gets. Every tenth of a degree Celsius that we raise the temperature, a lot of good studies about this. In rough terms, a tenth of a degree Celsius moves 100 million of our brothers and sisters around the planet from a safe climate zone to a dangerous one. That is, sets them up for having to leave their home because it's going to be underwater, or it's going to burn down, or it's going to be too hot. Literally, in some cases now, just too hot. There's big belt of the world sort of centered in Asia and parts of Asia and the Middle East, where the temperatures are just really reaching the point where people can't work outdoors much of the time now, and human habitation is getting very, very difficult. That's why the UN estimates that if we allow the temperature of this planet to rise 3 degrees, which is pretty much what we're on trajectory for at the moment, 3 degrees Celsius, that'll produce somewhere between 1 and 3 billion climate refugees. So something like a quarter or a third of the population of the planet will have to go live somewhere else. If we allow that to happen, obviously, I mean, look, a couple of million refugees on our southern border were enough to completely discombobulate our politics and bring out the worst, ugliest strains in our, multiply that by 1,000 and God knows what we have. But also, that's just people who, have to move, have to leave. And we're going to have to learn to deal with a lot of that because we caused it, and we're going to have to figure out how to absorb, instead of trying to build a wall and shoo people away, we're going to have to figure out how to absorb some of that because it's just and necessary and unavoidable, and also because it's good for us. I think that one of the things that we probably should be doing more of right now in this country is celebrating the fact that we are a nation of immigrants and celebrating what that means. It's the best argument you can make for America as a great country is the argument that it's successfully absorbed more people from more places and more cultures and things than any other country has ever imagined doing. And the fact that it's now become the source of our great ugliness and things is very sad, and hopefully we can get past that. We have no choice because the physical facts of this planet are pushing people at extraordinary rates now to move. So it's one of the reasons we have to try and limit because nobody really wants to leave their home if they don't have to. Everybody loves where they are just as much as you love where you are, And think how horrible it would be to have to leave here. I'm sure some of you have fought it because firestorms have swept over this valley and, endangered people in places and things. Well, that's on a much deeper level happening in so many places on the planet. It's one of the great ironies of our current ugliness in this world, that the very forces that are propping up Donald Trump, the oil industry, are also producing the conditions that are producing refugees on a vast scale. So someplace in this conundrum there are, important lessons to be learned. One of them is that we're all going to be better off if we build a lot of solar panels. Partly because it will lower the temperature, but partly because in an increasingly contingent and dangerous world, where we no longer are secure in the ways that we have been in the past, this is one of the things that gives us some sense of stability, some hope for. I wrote a piece for The Guardian a few weeks ago, just saying, if there's any constituency in the world that should understand the need for, desire for solar energy, it's all those preppers, because, if big trouble comes, we're not going to have oil refineries and oil pipelines. That's the first stuff that's going to break down, that's going to be hard. But the sun will keep coming up. And it's one of the places, happily, where we can work across some of the ideological and partisan divides in this country. I've lived my whole life in rural America, some of it in kind of purple state Vermont, and some of it in very red state parts of rural America. So I've had lots and lots of neighbors who have Trump flags on the mailbox and solar panels on the roof. And I know from talking to them at church or at fire company or whatever, that it's not really for climate reasons. It's because my home is my castle, and it's a better castle if it has an independent power supply, That's not why I put solar panels on my roof, but I'm American enough to feel that way too, I like the fact that my, electric meter runs backward and, all that. So there are real possibilities here, but they really, really include standing up for the idea that we're all the same and all equal around the world. And that's what's been so beautiful in Minneapolis. Watching just normal people under very difficult conditions. Just to begin with, it's 20 below zero day after day. But in the face of, being shot, being willing to stand up for their neighbors, for their Somali neighbors, their Hmong neighbors, all their neighbors, and just say, this is not who we are, not in our name. We actually, believe that stuff about all people are created equal. And we're going to, by God, make it real. I gotta say, one of the things that I've spent much of my life writing about and studying is the history of nonviolence and nonviolent movements. I think that the two great technologies of the 20th century were the solar panel and the nonviolent social movement. It's a way for the small and the many to stand up to the mighty and the few. And to watch what's happening right now in Minneapolis and Los Angeles and Chicago and Portland, Maine, and a bunch of other places is a great privilege for us just to get to see that in action. It is as moving, I said before, it's as moving and powerful as what people did for a year in Montgomery in 1955 that began to change the country, and we need to do it again, and we need to do it in a lot of ways, and we need to do it in a lot of places. We're all working hard to figure out how to help that effort. Certainly we are at Third Act, and Third Act Minnesota has been doing a wonderful job, and our Third Act One of the affinity groups we have is called Third Act Faith, and it's mostly retired clergy from different traditions around the country. And a lot of them were in Minneapolis yesterday getting arrested out at the airport. This is as real as it gets. Americans have had the privilege for most of our lives of living in a pretty easy bubble. And things have been pretty good for most of us for most of that time. And now is one of the moments when we get to figure out what that means and how we stand up now. And so far so good. What are they saying in Boston? I'm not cold, I'm not afraid. Minnesota taught me to be brave. That's a good mantra to go home on, I think. Yeah. All right.
Energy from heaven. I just have a couple of little logistical notes. I promised Bill good skiing. I also promised him an amazing community, so thanks mostly to you all for helping me deliver on that promise. What a great thing to see you all here tonight. Many thanks for coming out. On your way out, a couple of things. We will have a book signing with Bill over here. We have the sponsoring organizations, I think, all have tables over here with great ideas about how to get involved after that. And for those who are willing, there's a lot of chairs in this room and they all end up under this stage. So if you have time and a good back to help put away chairs without dragging them over the new floor, that'd be great too. Thank you all so very much.